I'm the older sibling, and I guess you could call me the responsible one. That's not a title I chose. It's just the role I got stuck with. My mom, Karen, has been on her own since the divorce. My dad remarried years ago, and honestly, he's so checked out of our lives that he might as well be living on another planet. Karen stayed single, which, I think, gave her this unspoken expectation that I would step in whenever she needed help. And for years, I did. I live a couple of states away, with a job that keeps me busy and 2 kids who seem to grow up faster every time I blink. My wife, Sophie, is amazing, but she's been quietly frustrated for years about how much time and energy I devote to my mom. She never says it outright, but I can see it in the way her shoulders tense whenever my phone buzzes. Meanwhile, my younger brother, Nate, lives about 10 minutes from Karen. He's 35, but if you met him, you'd swear he's still 22, coasting through life without a care. He barely has a steady job and treats responsibility like it's optional. He's always around mom, but not in the way that counts. If he's there, it's usually because he needs money or because he's buttering her up for something. The worst part? She eats it up. To her, Nate can do no wrong. A couple of months ago, Karen called me in a panic. She twisted her knee while carrying groceries up the stairs, and she was overwhelmed with doctor appointments and errands she couldn't handle alone. Of course, she called me, not Nate, not her neighbor, not a friend. Me. She didn't even ask outright. She just started crying about how she didn't know what to do, and I knew she expected me to fix it. I flew out 2 days later. Sophie wasn't happy, but what was I supposed to do? It's my mom. When I got there, I spent the next week taking care of everything. Groceries, prescriptions, bills, even deep cleaning her kitchen because she hadn't been able to keep up with it. She was grateful, but even then, she kept bringing up Nate. "Oh, Nate was here the other day," she said over dinner, her voice soft with pride. "He hung up some new curtains for me." I almost choked on my food. Curtains. I was spending my vacation days cleaning her fridge and taking her to physical therapy, and she was glowing about Nate and his damn curtains. I didn't say anything that time, but the resentment was bubbling. It wasn't just about the praise. It was the pattern. No matter what I did, I was always the reliable one, the one she could count on, while Nate got to swoop in, do the bare minimum, and still be her favorite. When Nate finally showed up during that trip, I wasn't surprised. He didn't call or check in while she was injured, but the second she was back on her feet, there he was. He sat at her kitchen table, all smiles and charm, before casually mentioning how tight money was for him lately. I watched her reach for her purse without hesitation, handing him a wad of cash like it was nothing. That night, I brought it up, not angrily, just carefully. I asked if she ever thought about setting boundaries with Nate. She looked at me like I'd suggested disowning him. "He's struggling," she said firmly. "He's not as stable as you. He needs my help." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. What would have been the point? She'd already decided that Nate's struggles were more important than my sacrifices. So, I swallowed my frustration, finished tidying up, and flew back home, telling myself I'd done my part. On the plane, Sophie texted me, "How did it go?" I stared at the screen for a while before replying, "Same as always." When I got home, I tried to fall back into my usual routine: work, helping the kids with homework, and spending time with Sophie. But the trip kept replaying in my head, especially that moment at the kitchen table when Mom handed Nate the money. I couldn't stop picturing her face, the way she smiled at him like he'd done something incredible by just showing up. Meanwhile, I was the one who had dropped everything, spent money on last-minute flights, and rearranged my life to make sure she was okay. It didn't sit right with me. Sophie noticed. She always does. One night after the kids were in bed, she poured me a glass of wine and said, "Okay, what's eating at you this time?" I hesitated because I didn't want to sound like a broken record. But eventually, I told her everything, about the trip, about the curtains, about the cash handout. By the time I was done, my voice was tight, and my chest felt heavy. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed together in that way she does when she's holding back from saying "I told you so." "I'm just tired," I said finally. "I'm tired of being the only one who actually helps. And it's not even about Nate. It's about her letting him get away with it. It's like no matter what I do, it's never enough to change how she sees us." Sophie nodded slowly. You know she's not going to change, right? She's had decades to fix this dynamic, and she hasn't. The only thing you can control is how much of yourself you give to it. You can say no. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that saying no wasn't that simple because it's my mom, and what kind of son turns his back on his mom? But deep down, I knew Sophie was right. I just wasn't sure I was ready to face what would happen if I stopped being the reliable one. The next call from Mom came sooner than I expected. She sounded stressed, talking fast about how her car needed repairs, and she wasn't sure how she was going to cover the bill until her next pension check came in. I knew what she was doing. She wanted me to offer to pay for it. For the first time, I didn't immediately say yes. Instead, I said, "Have you talked to Nate about helping out? He's right there, and maybe it's time he steps up a bit more." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she sighed and said, "Oh, you know how he is. He's going through a rough time. I don't want to burden him with this." I felt my frustration rising, but I kept my tone calm. "Mom, I'm going through things too. Everyone is. But you keep leaning on me because you know I'll say yes, and Nate gets a pass because you feel sorry for him. That's not fair, to me or to you." She didn't respond for a long time, and I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then she said quietly, "I didn't realize you felt this way." I wanted to believe that meant something, that maybe she was finally seeing my side. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Mom had a way of brushing things under the rug and pretending everything was fine until the next crisis came along. Sure enough, Nate called me the next day. "What's your problem?" he snapped as soon as I picked up. "Mom said you're refusing to help her now? What's your deal?" His tone made my blood boil, but I didn't let it show. "My deal is that I've been carrying this family for years, Nate. Maybe it's time you pitch in instead of leaving everything to me." "Oh, get over yourself," he shot back. "You think you're better than me because you've got a steady job and a nice house? You don't know what it's like to struggle the way I do." That was it. Struggle? I repeated. "You live 10 minutes from her and can't even bother to check in unless you need money. Don't talk to me about struggle, Nate." He hung up on me, which was probably for the best because I wasn't sure I could hold back the things I really wanted to say. Later that night, I told Sophie about the call. She shook her head, a mix of disbelief and exasperation on her face. "You know what your problem is," she said. "You keep waiting for them to see the sacrifices you've made and give you the credit you deserve. But they're not going to. Your mom's made up her mind about who Nate is and who you are, and nothing you do is going to change that." Her words stung because they were true. I'd spent so much time trying to prove myself, to show Mom that I was the one holding everything together, but it had never made a difference. And now I had to ask myself if it was worth it to keep trying. A few weeks passed, and things were quiet. Too quiet, really. No calls from Mom, no guilt trips, no angry texts from Nate. For a while, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten the message. But deep down, I knew better. Silence in my family didn't mean resolution. It meant someone was stewing, waiting for the right moment to drag me back in. Sure enough, the moment came one Saturday morning while I was making pancakes for the kids. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I saw it was Mom, I debated ignoring it. But the guilt kicked in, like it always does, and I answered. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound casual. Her voice was tight, the kind of tone she used when she was trying to sound calm but was actually on the verge of crying. "I hate to bother you," she started, which immediately set off alarm bells, "but I've been having a hard time with some bills this month. The car repair was more expensive than I thought, and, well, I just don't know what I'm going to do." I closed my eyes, gripping the spatula in my hand. "Did you talk to Nate?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I can't ask him," she said quickly, almost offensively. "He's trying so hard to get back on his feet, and I don't want to put more pressure on him." There it was again, that unshakable belief that Nate was somehow more fragile than the rest of us, that his struggles were more valid. It didn't matter that he was capable of stepping up. She'd already decided he couldn't handle it. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I've helped you with so many things over the years, but I can't keep bailing you out every time something comes up. You need to talk to Nate. He's right there." She let out a shaky sigh, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she said, I know you're frustrated, but I just can't rely on him the way I rely on you. He's not like you, Alex. You've always been the strong one. I felt like I'd been slapped. That sentence, the one she'd repeated to me so many times over the years, hit harder than ever. It wasn't a compliment. It was an excuse. A way for her to justify putting everything on me while letting Nate off the hook. I have to go, I said abruptly, not trusting myself to stay calm any longer. We'll talk later. I hung up before she could respond and leaned against the counter, staring at the mess of pancake batter and half-sliced fruit on the kitchen island. Sophie walked in, took one look at my face, and didn't even have to ask. What happened now? I told her about the call, about the same old excuses and how tired I was of hearing them. She listened, nodding quietly, and then said, You're going to have to make a decision, Alex. Either you keep doing this and accept that nothing's going to change, or you stop letting them pull you in. You can't keep sitting in this middle ground. It's eating you alive. Her words stuck with me for the rest of the day. She was right, of course, but the idea of walking away completely felt impossible. This was my mom. No matter how unfair the situation was, the thought of leaving her to figure things out on her own filled me with guilt. But Sophie's other point hit just as hard. If I kept this up, I'd never get out of this cycle. That evening, I called Mom back. I didn't want to fight, but I knew I needed to set the boundary more firmly. Mom, I said, cutting straight to the point, I need to be honest with you. I can't keep doing this. Every time there's a problem, you come to me because you know I'll fix it, but it's not fair to expect that from me. I have my own family, my own responsibilities. Her response was predictably defensive. I don't mean to put pressure on you, Alex. I just know I can trust you. You've always been there for me. I bit back my frustration. But that's the problem, Mom. You've let yourself rely on me so much that you don't even give Nate a chance to step up. And until you do, nothing's going to change. She sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that said she didn't agree but didn't want to argue. I'll think about it, she said finally, though we both knew she wouldn't. When I hung up, I felt drained but also weirdly relieved. I knew she wouldn't change overnight, maybe not ever, but at least I'd said what I needed to say. For the first time, I wasn't just going along with what she wanted. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Nate. Guess you told Mom I should be helping more. Real classy, Alex. I stared at the message, feeling the anger bubbling up again. But instead of replying, I put my phone down and walked away. Sophie was right. I couldn't keep sitting in the middle ground, and engaging with Nate would only drag me back into it. For the first time, I chose not to play their game, and it felt like the first real step toward taking back control of my life. The quiet didn't last long. A week or so after that conversation with Mom, I got a call from my aunt. We weren't particularly close, so I figured it must be important if she was reaching out. She didn't waste any time. Alex, she said, her voice cautious, I thought you should know your mom's been saying some things about you to the family. I felt my stomach sink. What kind of things? She's been telling people that you've abandoned her, my aunt said hesitantly, that you've decided she's too much of a burden, and now Nate is the only one helping her. I didn't believe it, but I thought you should know. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. I felt my face heat up as a mix of anger and disbelief coursed through me. After everything I'd done for her, after years of dropping everything to take care of her, this was what she chose to tell people. Thanks for letting me know, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though my hands were shaking. It's not true, obviously, but I'm not surprised she's saying it. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream, cry, or throw something. All those years of sacrifice, all the times I put my life on hold for her, and now she was turning me into the villain? And Nate, of course, was playing along, happy to soak up the sympathy as the good son, stepping up where I supposedly wouldn't. I told Sophie about it that night, pacing the living room as I vented. She listened quietly, and when I was done, she shook her head. She's trying to manipulate you, Alex. She knows the guilt works on you. So now she's using the family to get to you. If you let this get under your skin, she wins. I hated how right she was. It wasn't just about me, though. My mom's lies weren't just frustrating. They were damaging. If I didn't say something, the family would believe her, and that wasn't a reputation I was willing to live with. The next day, I called a few family members, not to stir up drama, but to set the record straight. I told them the truth, how I'd spent years supporting Mom, how Nate had taken advantage of her, and how I'd finally set some boundaries because I couldn't keep doing it all on my own. I even shared a few messages and receipts to back up my story, just to be sure there was no doubt. To my relief, most of them believed me. My cousin Sarah was the first to call me back. "I had no idea it was that bad," she said. "She made it sound like you'd completely cut her off, but it's clear you've done more than enough. I'm sorry I doubted you." One by one, other relatives started reaching out with similar reactions. They believed Mom's version at first because, honestly, why wouldn't they? She was their sister, their aunt, their friend. But now that they'd heard my side, the picture was a lot clearer. The fallout wasn't pretty. Mom found out I'd been talking to the family and called me in a fury. "How could you air our private issues like that?" she demanded. "I only told them the truth," I said calmly. "If you hadn't lied about me, I wouldn't have had to say anything." She sputtered for a moment, then fell back on her usual defense. "I never meant to make you look bad. I was just upset and felt abandoned." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Mom, you haven't been abandoned. I've been there for you more times than I can count, but I can't keep doing everything. And lying about me to the family? That's not okay." She didn't apologize. She never did, but she softened her tone. "I didn't think it would cause this much trouble," she said quietly. "Well, it has," I said firmly. "And I'm not going to let you or Nate make me out to be the bad guy anymore." When I hung up, I felt lighter. Not completely, but enough to notice. For once, I hadn't caved to her guilt trips or let her twist the narrative. I'd stood my ground, and it felt good. Over the next few weeks, things began to settle. The family was more cautious about believing Mom's stories, and I stopped getting those judgmental looks at gatherings. Nate, of course, wasn't happy. He sent me a few angry texts, accusing me of turning everyone against him, but I ignored them. I was done trying to reason with him. Mom still called occasionally, but our conversations were shorter, less emotional. I could tell she was testing the waters, trying to see if I'd fall back into my old patterns. But I didn't. Every time she brought up money or Nate's struggles, I redirected the conversation or ended the call. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the guilt crept in. But for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my relationship with her instead of letting it control me. And that, more than anything, gave me hope that I could finally break free. For a while, things stayed quiet. Mom still called occasionally, but the calls were less frequent and far less dramatic than they'd been in the past. She seemed to be testing how much she could ask without crossing the boundaries I'd set. I could tell she didn't like the new dynamic, but she wasn't pushing back too hard. Nate, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. No texts, no calls, no angry messages. That alone felt like a victory. Then one evening, just as I was starting to relax into this new normal, I got a text from Sarah. It was short and to the point. "Did you know your mom is updating her will?" I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. Of course, I didn't know. Mom never talked to me about those things, not directly anyway. Still, something about the text didn't sit right. I called Sarah to find out what she meant. "She's been talking to some of the family," Sarah said when she picked up. "She told Aunt Linda that she's leaving everything to Nate. Apparently, she feels like he needs it more than you." For a moment, I couldn't even process what she was saying. Everything? I finally managed. "She's leaving everything to Nate?" "That's what she's been saying," Sarah confirmed. "I thought you should know. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else." I thanked her for telling me and hung up, but my mind was spinning. Leaving everything to Nate? After all the times I'd stepped up, all the sacrifices I'd made for her, she was choosing to reward the one person who'd done nothing but take? It wasn't even about the money. I didn't need it, and frankly, I'd assumed she didn't have much to leave. But the principle of it stung in a way I couldn't ignore. It was like every moment of effort I'd put into helping her over the years had been completely erased. Sophie found me sitting on the couch later that night, staring blankly at my phone. "What's going on?" she asked, sitting down beside me. I told her everything, about Sarah's call, about the will, about how Mom was leaving everything to Nate because, apparently, he needed it more. By the time I finished, my voice was tight with frustration. Sophie didn't say anything at first, just let me vent. Finally, she said, "You know this isn't really about the will, right?" "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "It's about what the will represents," she said gently. "You've been waiting for her to acknowledge everything you've done, to show you that she values your sacrifices. And now you're realizing she probably never will." Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit because she was right. The inheritance itself didn't matter to me. What mattered was the fact that it felt like a final confirmation of something I'd been trying to ignore for years. Mom would always see Nate as the one who needed her most, and me as the one who could handle anything without her help. The next day, I decided to confront Mom. I wasn't planning to argue or demand an explanation. I just wanted to hear it from her directly. When I called, she sounded cheerful, like nothing was wrong. "Hi, Alex. How are the kids?" she asked brightly. "They're good," I said, skipping the small talk. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Is it true that you're leaving everything to Nate?" The pause on the other end of the line felt endless. Finally, she sighed. "Yes. He needs it more than you do. You've got a good job, a house, a family. You're doing fine. But Nate, well, he's had a harder time." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "Mom, it's not about the money," I said. "It's about what it says. After everything I've done for you, for years, you're choosing to reward the one person who's barely lifted a finger. Do you not see how that feels?" She hesitated, then said softly, "It's not about who's done more, Alex. It's about who needs more. And I know you. You're strong. You don't need me the way he does." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to find the right thing to say, but nothing came out. Finally, I just said, "I have to go, Mom. I'll talk to you later." When I hung up, Sophie found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "How'd it go?" she asked, though she probably already knew the answer. "She doesn't get it," I said quietly. "She doesn't see how much I've done for her, how much I've given up. All she sees is Nate and how much she thinks he needs her." Sophie sat down across from me and took my hand. "You've done everything you could, Alex. You can't make her see something she doesn't want to see. At some point, you have to stop waiting for her to appreciate it and start focusing on the people who already do." She was right, as always. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. After that call with Mom, I made a decision. I wasn't going to try to change her mind anymore. I wasn't going to argue, explain, or hope for some grand moment where she'd finally acknowledge everything I'd done. I'd spent too much of my life waiting for validation that was never going to come, and it was time to let it go. The weeks that followed were surprisingly peaceful. I kept my contact with Mom minimal, short, polite conversations where I didn't let her steer things toward money or Nate. If she hinted at needing help, I redirected or gently reminded her that she had other options. It wasn't easy, and the guilt still lingered in the background, but I felt lighter than I had in years. One day, Sarah called me again. "You'll never guess what Nate's been saying now," she said, her tone half amused, half annoyed. "Do I even want to know?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Apparently, he's telling people that you've completely abandoned your mom and that he's the one taking care of her now." I almost laughed. It was so ridiculous that I couldn't even get angry. "Of course he is," I said. "Let him say whatever he wants. The people who know me won't believe it." And that was the truth. I didn't feel the need to defend myself anymore. I'd already said my piece, and the people who mattered, the ones who'd seen the years of effort I'd put in, knew the real story. Nate could spin whatever narrative he wanted, but I wasn't going to waste another ounce of energy on it. Around that same time, I started noticing changes at home. Sophie seemed more relaxed, and the kids were happier, too. I wasn't constantly distracted by the next crisis with Mom or Nate, and it showed. We spent more time together, movie nights, soccer games, even a weekend trip to the beach. For the first time in years, I felt fully present with my family. Then one morning, I got a call from Mom's neighbor, Mrs. Connors. She was a sweet older woman who'd always kept an eye on Mom, and I immediately worried something had happened. "I just wanted to let you know," Mrs. Connors said, Your mom's been struggling a bit lately. She mentioned she's had trouble with money and some other things. I thanked her for letting me know, but my heart sank. I knew exactly what was happening. Nate was still draining her finances, and now, without me stepping in to cover the gaps, she was feeling the strain. That night, I talked to Sophie about it. I feel like I'm abandoning her, I admitted, staring down at my hands. You're not abandoning her, Sophie said firmly. You've been helping her for years, Alex. More than anyone else. But you can't fix this. She's made her choices, and now she has to live with them. That doesn't make you a bad son. It makes you human. Her words stuck with me. She was right, of course, but it still didn't feel right to leave Mom completely on her own. So, I found a middle ground. I set up a small, anonymous monthly deposit into her account, enough to cover basics like groceries and utilities, but not enough to be a safety net for Nate. She wouldn't know it was from me, and I wouldn't let it pull me back into the old cycle of constant involvement. As the months went by, I stuck to my boundaries. Mom still called occasionally, and sometimes she dropped hints about needing more help, but I didn't take the bait. Nate tried reaching out a few times, too, angry texts and half-hearted attempts to guilt me into helping, but I ignored him. And the funny thing was, life went on. The world didn't fall apart because I stopped being the dependable one. Mom found ways to manage, and Nate, well, he kept doing whatever it was Nate did. Looking back, I realized something important. My role in the family had never been about what I was capable of doing. It was about what they expected me to do. And the moment I stopped letting those expectations define me, I finally found peace. My relationship with Mom will probably never be what I hoped it could be. She'll always see Nate as the one who needs her, and I'll always be the one who's strong enough to handle things on my own. But now, I'm okay with that, because I know the truth. I know what I've done for her, and I know I've done more than enough. Most importantly, I've learned to value myself and my own family above the endless demands of people who'll never truly appreciate me. And that, more than anything, feels like a victory.